In this video I'm going to show you how you can measure voice onset time, and I'm going to show you how to do this using illustrations from Sindhi, which is the language of India. The first word we're going to listen to is this one, be cool,
Taru, taru,
which I think you should hear is a voiceless aspirated plosive. So the first thing I'm going to do is to make an annotation file. So I'm going to go annotate to text grid, and I just want one tier. I'm going to call it plosive, and it's going to be an interval tier rather than a point tier. So go OK, and now I click on both the sound and the text grid, and I go view and edit. Now I didn't actually need to make the label tier like this, but it makes things just a little bit easier, and then you can save your measurements later if you want to. You can also do this manually and just jot the values down without having a label file. Well, voice onset time is the point between the release of the plosive and the onset of the voicing, so we have to find those things and label them. So to do that, I'm going to select what's clearly the burst part and the initial part of the first vocalic portion, like that. Select, and now what I want to do is I want to put a label at the point where the release occurs, and it's much better to look at the waveform than the spectrogram. The waveform's more accurate. So I've put a boundary just there, you see, there we go. So just at the point where the friction starts. Now the onset of voicing is the part where periodicity starts, and you can see it's somewhere around here. Not very straightforward how you would determine the onset of voicing, because the voicing doesn't start immediately. You can see it grows in amplitude around here, which you can also see down in the spectrogram. And if you just see the effect of putting the measuring point just before the rise of the first period, and then let's just drag it along to the next bit, it's really a very small little difference. If we go in, it's 6 milliseconds, so it's not going to be a big deal if you decide to use one point rather than another. When you're labeling, the thing that you really care about is consistency. So as long as you're doing the same thing each time you make a measurement, then you'll normally be okay. So I think I'm going to zoom in here again and make a decision. So I think I'm going to put the cursor there, which is just about where the first period starts, maybe a little bit later, but it doesn't make much difference. This is a point I can recognize again, where the first cycle starts and it goes through the zero crossings line. So I'm going to put the other label in there. So if I zoom out again, we now have got a segment which is the portion between the release of the plosive and the onset of the voicing, and PRAAT says that this is 93 milliseconds. So one thing we could do is just fill in the label and say 93 milliseconds. So that's a voiceless aspirated one. Now here's another one.
taru, taru, taru.
And this one I think you can hear and see is voiceless and unaspirated. So I'm going to do the same as I did before. I need a label file, don't I? So let's go to text grid, and now we go to select the sound file in the text grid, view and edit, and I will zoom in, select. So there is the onset of the plosive. Again, I'm looking at the waveform rather than the spectrogram. The waveform is a bit more reliable. So I'm going to put a label that starts there, and then you can see the voicing actually in this case has a much more rapid, much more abrupt start than it did in the earlier case. Let's just see if we put the label there. So this segment here has definitely got no voicing in. If we move the label along up to where the first zero crossing of the cycle appears, so about there. Now we hear a click, and that's rather a nasty click, so we don't want that in there. I'm going to go back to where I was, which is there. So according to PRAAT, this is 20.79. We'll call that 21 milliseconds. So there's another voice onset time. I've got one left. Cindy also has implosives, and if we just make a text grid just to be consistent, so we've got child, text grid, view and edit.
Maru, maru.
You can hear the very distinctive implosive sound. So the plosive portion is here in the middle. You can see the transient there in the spectrogram. A bit harder to see in the waveform, but it's there. So we'll select and zoom in on that. Now this time the voicing starts before the plosion is achieved, so we need to put the label here at the beginning of the voicing. I'm going to put it just there before the rise of the first cycle. See, again, I'm looking at the waveform rather than the spectrogram. Now we need to find the part where we've got a burst here, which is not quite so easy to do. Might have to zoom in and out. So the spectrogram tells us the burst is somewhere around here, and actually here we see the voicing, and you can see that just about there's a perturbation to the voicing, and the quality of the voicing changes. Again, very difficult to be terribly precise about where these things occur, but the difference between, say, this point here and that point there is probably only a millisecond or so, and there's no point being too precious about these things. 1 millisecond here or there isn't going to ruin anybody's results. So we'll put the label there, but just to check, let's zoom out and out again. If we listen to the segment, which shouldn't have any plosion in it, yeah, we've got that very distinctive swallowing sound as the larynx is lowered for the implosive. And now if we hear the next segment that follows it, this is where we should hear the plosion. And you can just hear the plosion right at the beginning, so I'm quite happy with that label. Now the distance between these two labels, according to PRAAT, is 0.102 seconds, so that's 102.6 milliseconds. Let's round that up to be consistent. So that's 103 milliseconds, but because the voicing starts before the release, this of course needs to be a minus value. So that's how you measure voice onset time, or one method for measuring voice onset time using PRAAT.